Hello everyone, today we are going to be finishing Lucky Strike, so we have chapters 27, 28, and 29, and then we're done. So, let's see how it ends. Chapter 27. Nate sat in between Ricky Sands and Chum Bailey on the fine leather seats of a slightly used pickup truck, Mr. Bowditch purring in his lap. You got a driver's license, Ricky? He asked as they crossed the bridge of Apalachola. Ricky shrugged. No, I'm too young to have a driver's license. I know how to drive, though. My grandpa taught me how to drive his boat when I was 9, and I've been driving cars around my dad's dealership for almost that long. He leaned forward and peered through the windshield. Of course, I've never driven this far before. Chum rubbed Mr. Bowditch on the top of his head, just where he liked it. When my mama finds out about me being in on this, she'll most likely skin me alive. I don't want you to get skinned alive, either of you. I don't care, Chum said. You and Jen are my best friends. Still, he ducked down out of sight as they drove past Piggly Wiggly where his mother worked. Chum, how did you know I was out looking for Jen that night? Ricky, he said, sitting back up. He came and got me after he talked to you outside. Then I noticed Jen wasn't there. Nate nodded. But how did you know to find us at the beach? The mayor, Chum simply said. Nate watched the signs for Port St. Joe, Beacon Hill, and Mexico Beach come and go. He had no idea what they'd do once they got to the hospital. How would he know what room she was in? Would her parents let him see her? Oh, they could be in for a whole boatload of trouble, he knew. He broke out into a cold sweat. An hour after leaving Paradise Beach, Ricky whipped the truck into the parking space at the Panama City Hospital. He grinned at Nate and Chum. We made it. High fives all around. You go in. We'll be right behind you. It was then Nate noticed Ricky's knuckles were white as the sand. He touched Ricky's arm. You did real good, Ricky. Your daddy would be proud of how well you drove. The bright fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell of the hospital brought back a storm of memories, not good memories, to Nate. His lightning scars burned. His head throbbed. Right at that very moment, he wanted nothing more than to walk back outside and go home. But Jen was somewhere in this place, and he meant to find her. Nate gathered up twice-struck courage, squared his hunched shoulders, and walked up to the nurse's station. A woman with little glasses perched on the end of her long nose looked up and as he cleared his throat. I'm here to see a patient, Nate said with all the authority he could muster. The nurse surveyed him through narrow eyes. You are, huh? And who might the patient be? Genesis Beam. I believe she was brought in 3 days ago. The woman tapped the keys on her computer. Beam, she muttered under her breath. Nate drummed his fingers on the desk, wondering just how many Genesis beams there could be in this computer, especially one struck by lightning. Genesis beam, the nurse declared, as if she had just made up the whole notion of a Genesis beam. Right there. The kid struck by lightning. Poor thing. Yes, ma'am, he agreed. I'm here to see her. I just don't know what room she's in. The nurse looked at Nate, then to the left and right of him and behind him. Where are your parents? Minors aren't allowed to visit patients without an adult. She crossed her arms over her chest with finality. Nate licked his lips. Well, my parents are already up here. They're visiting. I just don't know the room number. He tried to get a peek at the computer screen. Your parents are already up here. How did you get here? Nate gulped. This was not going well. Not going well at all. Well, you see, Just then, Chum Bailey and Ricky Sands jogged into the hospital. Sorry we took so long, Nate, Ricky said. The nurse narrowed her eyes to slits. And who might you be? Ricky stood as tall as his 5'2" frame would carry him, leaned in confidently to the nurse behind the desk and said, I'm Ricky Sands. My dad owns Crystal Sands new and used cars in Paradise Beach. I'm sure you've heard of it. The nurse frowned and shot a look at Chum. And you? Chum smiled. I'm Charles Bailey, ma'am, and this here is Mr. Bowditch. At the sound of his name, the cat's head popped up out of the top of the big boy's shirt. The nurse's eyes widened. Is that a cat? She asked in a way that led the boys to believe she might be none too fond of cats. Chum looked down at the small furry head and paws sticking out the top of his shirt. He frowned. Why, yes, ma'am, that's what Mr. Bowditch is. Mr. Bowditch twitched his pink little nose and whiskers. Young man, animals are expressly forbidden in the hospital. She pointed her finger at the sliding glass doors. You must take it out this instant. Chum's frown deepened. Ma'am, Mr. Bowditch is a him and not an it, and the nurse stood, her face a fury, and her fist balled at her hips. I don't care what it is. Take that cat. Clearly the nurse had forgotten all about Nate. He peered around the computer screen. He could just make out 317. The nurse turned back to Nate and was just about to tell him she'd have enough of all this nonsense when Mr. Bowditch decided he'd had quite enough of all this too warm confines of Chum's shirt. With one graceful leap, he pushed himself out of the boy's shirt and leapt onto the desk. The nurse gasped. Get that cat off my desk, she flapped her hands at Mr. Bowditch. Shoo, shoo, get away from here. The office doors flew open. Heads popped out of cubicles to see what the ruckus was about. Go, Nate, Ricky hissed. Under the cover of chaos, Nate dashed to the elevator and slid in. As the elevator doors closed, he heard Chum calling, Come back, Mr. Bowditch, come back! He looked at all the different buttons. On a hunch, he punched the button for the 3rd floor and prayed once he got there, he'd be able to find her room. He stepped out onto the 3rd floor. The nurse sitting behind the desk was on the phone. There's a what loose downstairs? He heard her ask. He trotted down the hallway looking for room 317. 311, 313, 314, 315, and then he saw it. Room 317. He pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him was this. The room was dark, the shades pulled. A monitor with lots of lights and bright lines and beeps lit one corner of the room. A small figure lay still as still could be beneath the crisp hospital bed sheets. And beside that figure, sitting hunched over in a chair, hunched from the weight of grief and with his head in his hands, was Reverend Beam. Nate eased the door closed and walked over to the grieving man. He touched his shoulder. Hey, he whispered. The Reverend looked up, his eyes wide and wet. If Nate hadn't known this was Reverend Beam, he'd never have recognized him. The face that looked up at him was not the face of the man he knew. The face was not the shining beacon of hope and light and absolute certainty he counted on. This was not the face full of humor and kindness he loved almost as well as he loved the sea-worn face of his grandfather. This was the face of an utterly broken man. Nate, the Reverend said, You're here? Nate tried to smile, but the muscles in his face didn't cooperate. Yes, sir, I'm here. He squeezed the man's shoulder. The Reverend blinked like he'd just woken up. He ran his hand across his face and looked around the room. It's a nice room. Folks have been very kind, he said, nodding. Yes, sir, Nate said. Where's Mrs. Beam? The Reverend looked around the room as if wondering that himself. Then he said, she went down to the cafeteria to see if they had liverwurst on rye. She thought maybe if Jen smelled her favorite food, she'd wake up and... His face crumbled. I'm here now, sir. Why don't you take a little break? Go get some coffee or something. The Reverend stood. A tiny light flickered in his eyes. I'll go find Mrs. Beam. Would it be okay with you if I left for just a minute? He reached down and touched his daughter's cheek. I'll be right back, I promise. The door whispered closed. The monitor beeped. For the first time, Nate took a good look at Jen, without her glasses. Her face looked so very small and vulnerable. Spider-like burns sprawled across her jaw. Her right arm and hand were wrapped in bandages. But the thing that almost brought Nate to his knees was her missing eyebrow. They were completely and utterly gone. The eyebrows Mrs. Beam had worked so hard to preserve from Jen's worrying had been vaporized by the lightning. Oh, Jen, he said. He sat in the chair next to his very best friend. He told her all he could remember of that night. How the lightning had struck as he'd grabbed her hand, and how the force of it had thrown them a good 6 feet away. How the mayor had found them there on the beach and brought him back to the world. And how he had tried his very best to do CPR on Jen, just like she'd done on him. Nate told Jen how he'd woken up on his own in the bed the next day, purely and totally amazed to still be alive, and how miraculous he'd thought it was, a true miracle, that it was the framed photograph of his long-dead parents that saved him. I figured I was the luckiest boy in the world, he said, until Grandpa told me you were in the hospital and wouldn't wake up. He took a deep, watery breath. I knew I had to get over here to try to fix you like I fixed the bay leaf in Grandpa's truck. He wiped out his nose. Well, maybe I did. Or maybe it was just a coincidence like you always said. The girl lay silent as the moon. Nate sighed. So here I am, Jen, and I sure as heck hope that lightning didn't take my luck away. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and laid his hands on her good arm. Nothing. Come on, Jen, he pleaded, pressing harder. The only movement was the rising and falling of her chest. Dang it, Nate said in despair. He felt his burnt toast making its way up his throat. I've run out of luck after all. He gripped her bandaged hand with the scarred one and said into her ear, I know exactly where you were, Genesis, Magnolia Beam, and I know how wonderful it feels. I'm sorry I brought you back, but... His voice cracked and then trailed off. Maybe you're still there and you don't want to come back. But Jen, I need you. And the turtles need you too. You're our best friend. One of the green ziggity lines on the monitor beeped and jumped. I need the smartest girl in all of Franklin County to tell me how stupid it is to believe in luck. I need you to tell me what the odds of a hurricane are coming in the spring. And what the odds are of 2 people getting struck by lightning at the same time. Silence. Nate pressed his face into his arm. Come on, Jen. Come back. Weirdos and losers stick together through thick and through thin. Amen, a smoky voice said. Nate's eyes flew open. There, gazing back at him, as if from a great height, were the eyes of his best friend, Genesis Beam. She smiled with just the tiniest corner of her mouth. Hey, Jen, he said with a grin that split his face in two. Hi, Nathaniel, she said, as the fingertips of her bandaged hand wiggled against his hand. Her fingers felt like little live coals. The door flew open. Reverend Beam dashed in, followed by Mrs. Beam. I'm sorry it took so long, Nate. There was some crazy fool cat loose in the cafeteria, and... Hey, Daddy, Jen said. For the first time in the known history of heaven and earth, the good Reverend Beam was rendered completely speechless. Mrs. Beam dropped the plate of liverwurst on rye. Dear God, Mrs. Beam whispered, pressing her hands to her mouth. My baby's awake. Nate let go of Jen's hand and stepped aside. Reverend and Mrs. Beam gathered their daughter in their arms and wept. And for the first time in all the many years Nate had known Genesis Beam, he saw tears flow from her eyes. Eyes uncountably and forever after, silver. Right. Chapter 28. Several nights later, Nate sat next to Jen's bed at the Panama City Hospital. This time, the ride over from Paradise Beach had been much less exciting with Grandpa and old Alfred. Only he came along this time. Ricky's father had grounded him until he was 30, and Chum's mama had, in fact, skinned him alive. Well, nearly. Is it true that you get to go home tomorrow? Nate asked. Yes, she said with a smile. I can't wait. He nodded, remembering how wonderful it was to be home in their little trailer in his room, in his own bed. Of course, there won't be any climbing on the roof to monitor my weather station, at least not for a while. She nodded toward the wheelchair waiting in the corner. Nate flinched every time he looked at it. He really had been lucky he hadn't been hit directly by lightning like she had. As if reading his mind, Jen said, I only have to use it for a few weeks. It's not that big a deal. Changing the subject, she asked, Any signs of the turtles? He grinned. Lots. They're coming in like crazy now and laying eggs, too. She twisted and untwisted her blanket with her good hand. And I'm not there to look after them. What's going to happen to them, Nathaniel? He smiled again and handed her the latest issue of Paradise Beach Herald. The headline announced, Miracle saves kids from lightning and town from hurricane. And just below that, he pointed to a smaller headline that read, Town honors local lightning girl by protecting turtles. Jen squinted at the fuzzy newsprint. I can't wait until I get my new glasses. Can you read it to me? Nate cleared his throat. Everybody in Paradise Beach knows how Genesis Beam, daughter of Reverend and Mrs. Beam, loves loggerhead turtles. She is the creator of the turtle rules and self-appointed guardian of the reptilian wayfarers. When they visit our shores every year to lay their eggs, but no one knew just how much she loved the turtles until the recent and unlikely hurricane struck. To quote Charles Bailey, age 12, "She loves them so much she almost got herself killed." Miss Beam risked her life in the middle of Hurricane Amelia by running down the beach and gathering up in a bait bucket the one nest of loggerhead turtles that had been laid. During her valiant attempt to save the eggs, Miss Beam was struck by lightning. Because of the young girl's heroism and devotion to the turtles, the town is organizing a turtle watch in her honor. The Paradise Beach Garden and Beautification League, along with Miss Ruth Beam, age 6, daughter of Reverend Beam. Gosh, why am I crying? Daughter of Reverend Beam and Mrs. Beam are organizing the effort. We need folks to patrol the beaches not only to watch for turtle nests and tracks, but also to enforce Genesis's turtle rules, Mrs. Belk, president of the Garden and Beautification League, declared. We need all hands on deck. Big Jim Sands, captain of the Dixie Queen, said, "It's what that little girl would want." Hanson Hardware is providing free flashlights and batteries for those who don't have them, and Dick McHarg, owner of the Sand Flea Motel, will provide free hot chocolate to those taking the evening watch shifts. "I'm proud to do it," he said. We're lucky as all get out to have these turtles come back here every year, indeed." "Wow," Jen whispered. "All those people are helping the turtles because of me?" "Oh, heck yeah," he said. "Ricky, Connor, and Buddy are helping out, and the whole town council." She shook her head with the pure wonderment of it. "Maybe they aren't a band of Philistines after all. Oh, and my teacher, Mr. Peck, is giving anyone who helps extra credit, and Miss Lillian is composing a special poem about it. There's even talk about starting an annual turtle festival." "I guess the turtles aren't just mine and yours anymore," Jen said. "Who would have thought?" "It's a miracle just like my shoes," Nate said, holding his legs out straight, tapping his toes of his 2 red high-top sneakers together. Jen shook her head. "I still can't believe you found the other shoe yesterday on the side of Highway 98. She reached up to pluck her long-gone eyebrow. "I can't even begin to calculate those odds." "Hey," he said, "I've been wanting to ask you, what are the odds of a person getting struck by lightning twice?" Jen perked up. "Well, let's see. If the odds of a person getting struck by lightning once are about 1 in 650,000, then you multiply that by..." She frowned and drew an imaginary chalkboard in the air. 360 billion, Nate replied. Jen's jaw dropped. Nate blinked, then said, "Where'd that come from?" "You," she said with a gasp. "How'd you know that?" He shook his head. "I don't know. It just sort of popped into my head, but how?" Nate waited for his friend, who was obviously chewing on this information like a dog with a particularly meaty bone, to tell him the specific explanation for this phenomenon. Energy transference? A shifting of magnetic poles, perhaps? Jen shrugged and smiled. She looked out her hospital window into the evening sky, growing as lavender as her mother's favorite going-to-church hat. Magic, I guess. Right, chapter 29, last chapter. A week later, the residents of Paradise Beach again gathered at the Billy Bowlegs Park for a fish fry. Although the congregations of the town's 3 churches and 1 synagogue had organized the event as a fundraiser for Reverend Beam's family, everyone agreed it was also to celebrate the town's good fortune. Once again, table after table groaned under the bountiful weight of salads, casseroles, gumbos, mounds of biscuits, cornbread, and of course hush puppies. The men and women of all 3 congregations and 1 synagogue had outdone themselves in glory. Grandpa and Reverend Beam manned the vats of frying fish and hush puppies. Chum Bailey, Ricky Sands, and Jinx Malloy poured cup after cup of lemonade and iced tea. "Hey, Sparky," Jinx said as she sloshed lemonade into a cup for Nate. "We're getting up a baseball game after everyone eats. Want to play?" He shrugged and gripped the handles of Jen's wheelchair. "I don't think I'm lucky anymore," he said, still tasting burnt toast and sour milk from that morning. Jinx snorted and flipped her hair her red braids over her shoulders. "Aw, heck, I never believed in all the Midas touch malarkey," she declared. She nodded at Jen. "She can play, too. We can take turns pushing her around the bases. It's just for fun, anyways." "I don't think so," Nate said, moving closer to his friend and touching her arm. He knew without a doubt that, one, to go around the bases implied that one would hit the ball, which, two, he was pretty sure Jen would never do. "I think we'll just—" "Heck yes," Jen fairly yipped, which was something he had never ever heard Genesis Beam do. She's also been known to giggle and guffaw, and look all dreamy since the lightning strike. "We'll play. I can be a receiver or a goalie even." Ricky groaned and Chum laughed. The last of the sun's rays threw wide, spangled planks of light across Billy Bowleg's park. It slipped across the goals, squabbling around the trash bins, and settled lightly on the sleeping head of Brandon Sands. It touched the shoulders of Chum, Jinx, and Ricky as they picked their teams for baseball. It warmed the back of the mayor of Paradise Beach as he begged yet another hush puppy, and moved on to rest on the wide, humbled shoulders of the good Reverend Beam. Everyone grew quiet as he took the stage and stepped up to the microphone. He cleared his throat and clasped his hands in front of him. "I stand before you, friends and family, a most grateful man, a most lucky man. For we are gathered here again to celebrate not one, but but three miracles. We celebrate the town surviving a direct hit from the hurricane with barely a scratch. We celebrate the miracle of two precious children struck by lightning and living." The Reverend smiled lovingly at Nate and Jen. "For that, I will be eternally grateful." "Amen," murmured the crowd. Picking up steam, the Reverend continued, "But truly the greatest miracle we celebrate is the strength and compassion of our town." He spread his arms wide, taking the entire community of Paradise Beach. "We celebrate the bounty and wonder of this place we call home and the folks we call friends and neighbors. And we count our many blessings and tender mercies every day." "Amen," Jen whispered. She held her bandaged hand. "What about a high five?" she asked with a smile. Nate grinned and pressed his scarred hand gently against hers. A mighty crack. "Go, Jen, go!" Nate and Jinx cried. Genesis Magnolia Beam, the smartest girl in all of Franklin County, and maybe even all of Florida, dropped the bat, burning her hands. Chum and Ricky dug in shoulder to shoulder, wheeling her from base to base. Jen's silver eyes gleamed with a million tiny lights. And Nathaniel Harlow, who many had said was the unluckiest boy in all of Franklin County, watched his friends with a grin wide and bright as the bay and the Gulf and all the waters beyond. He rubbed his thumb over his knobby rabbit's foot. Yes, there were great bounties and blessings indeed. School would be out in just a few days, with the whole summer stretching ahead like a brand new world. Days out on the Gulf with his grandpa and the sweet Jody. Crabbing and scalloping with Chum, Ricky, and Jinx over in the bay. And at the end of the summer, the town would see the loggerhead hatchlings safely out to sea. There would be trails, too. Jen had a long summer of physical therapy ahead of her. There would be trials, too. Jen had a long summer of physical therapy ahead of her. The doctors promised if she worked hard, and when had Genesis Beam not worked hard, her legs would be good as new. And Nate promised her that when they were, he'd teach her to ride a bike. And then, just then, if anyone had asked, he'd have said he sure enough was the luckiest boy in all of Franklin County, and most likely all of Florida, too. The end. All right, we finished it off, and that's it. See you guys later.